The heat was unbearable. May 27, 1942, and the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor felt like the inside of a furnace. Commander Joseph Rochefort loosened the belt on his faded red bathrobe, the unofficial uniform he'd worn for weeks in this windowless dungeon. Around him, the IBM punch card machines clattered like mechanical heartbeats, sorting thousands of cards punched with tiny holes, each one representing a fragment of the enemy's mind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On the desk before him lay a single sheet of paper covered in 5-digit numbers. To anyone else, they were meaningless. To Rochefort, they were a death sentence or a salvation, depending on whether he was reading them correctly. The numbers spelled out Japan's next move, a massive operation involving 4 aircraft carriers and an invasion force. The target was designated with 2 letters, AF. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his office 3 floors above, waiting for an answer. He had 3 carriers left in the entire Pacific, 3 battered ships against the most powerful navy on Earth. If Rochefort told him where the Japanese would strike, Nimitz would gamble everything on that intelligence. If Rochefort was wrong, America would lose the war before summer ended. The weight of that decision pressed down on every man in the room. How does a handful of men in a basement, armed with nothing but pencils and IBM machines, defeat an empire? How do you read the mind of an enemy who believes his secrets are perfectly safe? Stay with us to discover how the most important intelligence breakthrough in American history transformed a Japanese ambush into an American triumph, and how the man who made it possible died without the recognition he deserved. 6 months earlier, the world had changed in less than 2 hours. December 7th, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. Sailors slept late on battleships moored in neat rows, families dressed for church. The Pacific Fleet sat at anchor, powerful but utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. At 7:55 that morning, the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. 353 aircraft descended in 2 devastating waves. Within minutes, the harbor became an inferno. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that over 1,100 men died instantly, entombed forever in twisted metal that still lies on the harbor bottom today. The USS Oklahoma rolled over, trapping 429 sailors and Marines inside her hull. Some survived in air pockets for days, their desperate hammering on the steel audible to rescue workers who couldn't reach them in time. 8 battleships sunk or damaged. Over 180 aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. 2,403 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield against Japanese expansion, lay shattered in the morning sun. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had planned the attack, had missed the most valuable targets. All 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were absent that morning. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island, delayed by weather. Lexington was delivering planes to Midway. Saratoga sat in dry dock on the west coast. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would win this war, though few yet understood that fundamental shift. Through a combination of luck and Japanese miscalculation, America still possessed the weapons that mattered most. The Japanese had also ignored the fuel storage tanks holding millions of gallons of oil, bypassed the repair facilities and submarine base, and left the naval yard infrastructure intact. These oversights would prove catastrophic for Japan. Within months, Pearl Harbor would transform from a symbol of defeat into the staging base for America's counteroffensive. In the basement of that same administration building, Commander Joseph Rochefort inherited what seemed like an impossible task. His unit, officially designated Fleet Radio Unit Pacific but known as Station Hypo, had been trying to read Japanese naval communications for years with limited success. Before Pearl Harbor, they could decipher perhaps 10 to 15% of Japanese messages, and most of those only partially. It was enough to provide some intelligence value, but nowhere near enough to predict major operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The main Japanese operational code, designated JN-25 by American analysts, was a masterpiece of complexity. It consisted of approximately 30,000 5-digit number groups, each representing a word or phrase: carrier, attack, midway, fuel, reinforce. To make decryption even more difficult, the Japanese super-enciphered these code groups using additive tables. They essentially encrypted their messages twice. Here's how it worked. An operator would encode a message using the codebook, converting words into 5-digit numbers. Then, to ensure no one could simply steal their codebook and read everything, they added another random 5-digit number from a separate additive book. The two numbers were combined using non-carrying addition. If 2 digits added up to 10 or more, you only kept the last digit. The result looked completely random, resistant to every code-breaking technique in existence. For American cryptanalysts, the challenge was staggering. Without knowing both books, decoding was nearly impossible. And the Japanese changed their books every few months to stay ahead. On December 1st, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, they had switched to a new version called JN-25B. Every code group that Rochefort's team had painstakingly identified became useless overnight. They were back at the beginning, staring at streams of meaningless numbers. Rochefort had known an attack was coming somewhere. Traffic analysis, the study of communication patterns without reading actual content, had shown increased Japanese naval activity. Message volume was spiking. Radio call signs were changing more frequently. Ships were moving. But the Japanese strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor had maintained perfect radio silence during their voyage from Japan. You cannot track ships that emit no signals. It was the most profound intelligence failure in American history. The attack came as a complete and devastating surprise. Rochefort understood that dwelling on failure would guarantee more disasters. The only path forward was through the enemy's communications. If Station Hypo could break JN-25B, could read enough Japanese messages to understand their plans, perhaps Pearl Harbor need not be repeated. Perhaps intelligence could provide Admiral Nimitz with the weapon that might offset Japan's superiority, knowledge of enemy intentions. Joseph John Rochefort had been an unlikely candidate for such critical work. Born in Dayton, Ohio, he had enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17. His early career suggested nothing special, just another young officer working his way through the ranks. But someone noticed that Rochefort had a talent for solving complex puzzles. He was excellent at bridge, a card game requiring pattern recognition, memory, and logical deduction. These weren't trivial skills. They indicated a mind that could find patterns in chaos. In the mid-1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of language and cultural study. During those years, Rochefort lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese at the Navy's language school, and immersed himself in Japanese culture. He didn't just learn the language. He learned how Japanese people thought, how they communicated, how their military culture shaped their decision-making. This cultural knowledge, combined with his cryptanalytic training, made him uniquely qualified to lead Station Hypo when war came. His deputy was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a Naval Academy graduate who had trained under Agnes Driscoll, the legendary cryptanalyst known throughout the community as Miss Aggie. Driscoll had been breaking codes since World War I and had pioneered the use of IBM punch card machines for code breaking. Her insight that tabulating machines could be adapted for cryptanalysis had revolutionized the field. Dyer possessed an encyclopedic memory for code groups and an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in seemingly random numbers. The team also included Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who had studied Japanese in Tokyo, and a handful of linguists, mathematicians, and radio operators. They worked in a cramped, poorly ventilated basement where the heat from IBM machines made proper uniforms unbearable. Rochefort's bathrobe wasn't eccentric behavior, it was practical. Results mattered more than military protocol in this workspace where the fate of nations was being decided. The work was painfully slow and frustrating. Each intercepted message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups, captured by radio stations scattered across the Pacific. Radio operators at stations in Hawaii, Australia, and other locations listened to Japanese naval frequencies 24 hours a day, transcribing every message they heard. These messages were forwarded to Station Hypo for analysis. First, the cryptanalysts had to strip off the additive encryption. The Japanese added random 5-digit numbers to each code group. Decryption required identifying which additive table had been used for each message, then subtracting the additive to reveal the original code group. This process alone could take hours for a single message. The cryptanalysts maintained massive files of recovered additives, trying to identify patterns in how the Japanese used their tables. Once they had the original code groups, the real work began. The analysts maintained card catalogues representing years of accumulated knowledge about what each 5-digit number might mean. They made educated guesses based on context, comparing how specific code groups appeared in different messages. A code group that appeared frequently in messages between carriers might mean aircraft or aviation gasoline. One that appeared in logistics messages might mean fuel or supplies. The IBM punch card machines helped them search through thousands of messages to find patterns, but the actual analysis required human intelligence and intuition. The machines could sort and search, but only human analysts could interpret the results and make intuitive leaps. It was detective work of the highest order, requiring mathematical precision, linguistic knowledge, cultural understanding, and creative thinking. By March 1942, Station Hypo had made sufficient progress that they could provide useful intelligence about Japanese operations. The breakthrough hadn't come from a single dramatic moment, but from months of grinding work. Each recovered code group made subsequent messages slightly more readable. Gradually, painfully, the opacity of Japanese communications began to yield. They contributed intelligence to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, helping the US Navy locate Japanese carriers and achieve a tactical draw that halted Japan's advance toward Australia. It was the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never came within sight of each other, all combat conducted by aircraft. It demonstrated that American carriers could fight effectively against experienced Japanese forces, but the work remained frustratingly incomplete. Even at their best, they could read perhaps 30 to 40% of any given message. Many remained completely opaque. The Japanese continued to change codebooks and additives. The pressure was relentless. Every message might contain intelligence that could save American lives. Every hour spent on fruitless analysis was an hour that could have been spent elsewhere. Then, in mid-May, they began intercepting messages about a massive operation. The traffic volume increased dramatically. Messages flew between combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine squadrons, and invasion forces. All pointed to a major offensive scheduled for early June. Japanese operational security was good, but they had to communicate to coordinate a complex operation involving dozens of ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean. The target was designated AF in the Japanese location code system. Station Hypo believed AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii that housed a small but strategically important American airbase. If Japan captured Midway, they would threaten Hawaii itself and possess a base from which to interdict American communications across the Central Pacific. But in Washington, the Navy's main cryptanalysis center, designated OP-20G, disagreed with Station Hypo's assessment. The Washington analysts believed AF might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, or perhaps a renewed offensive in the South Pacific, or even an attack on Hawaii itself. Without certainty about the target, Admiral Nimitz couldn't position his forces effectively. If he concentrated his carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target. The disagreement intensified through late May. Rochefort reported directly to Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, his friend from their years studying Japanese together in Tokyo. This direct communication worked brilliantly within the Pacific Theater, but it infuriated the Washington command structure. Rochefort was bypassing the established chain of command, and that made powerful enemies. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations who commanded the entire U.S. Navy, trusted his staff in Washington more than this informal arrangement in Hawaii. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, insisted that all intelligence analysis should be centralized in Washington. The disagreement wasn't just about bureaucratic territory. Lives hung in the balance. With only 3 carriers against Japan's fleet, America couldn't afford to be wrong even once. Everything depended on determining what AF meant. That's when Captain Wilfred Holmes, one of Rochefort's staff members, conceived a brilliant idea. He suggested that Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and the base was running short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then reported that AF was short of water, Station Hypo would have definitive proof. It was simple, almost too simple to work. But simplicity was its strength. The Japanese were intercepting American communications just as the Americans were reading Japanese messages. If they overheard an emergency message about water shortages, they would have no reason to suspect it was false. Water equipment broke down regularly in tropical climates. Rochefort immediately recognized the brilliance and brought it to Edwin Layton, who presented it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz approved the plan immediately. The garrison commander at Midway received instructions via secure submarine cable to transmit an emergency request for water supplies in plain language that anyone could intercept. Around May 19th to 21st, Midway sent the message. The transmission went out in clear, unencrypted language. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report stating that AF was experiencing water shortages. The proof was irrefutable. AF meant Midway. The Japanese were coming. But Washington remained skeptical. OP-20G insisted the attack would come in mid-June, while Station Hypo predicted early June based on date indicators in the messages. The date-time groups in Japanese messages were super-enciphered beyond the standard JN-25 encryption, making them particularly difficult to decrypt. OP-20G hadn't broken the date-time encryption. Station Hypo had, thanks to a breakthrough by Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan. Finnegan discovered the method the Japanese used to encrypt their date-time groups. It was a separate system layered on top of JN-25, requiring additional mathematical analysis. This breakthrough allowed Station Hypo to determine not just where the Japanese would strike, but when. On May 26th, they successfully decrypted orders, specifying that the attack would occur on June 4th or 5th, 1942. This level of precision was unprecedented. Admiral Nimitz would know not just where to position his forces, but when the enemy would arrive. By May 27th, Rochefort's team had decrypted enough messages to provide Nimitz with almost the entire Japanese order of battle. They knew the force would include 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. They knew about the battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and invasion force, carrying 5,000 troops. On May 27, 1942, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Rochefort and Layton presented this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. The room was crowded with skeptical staff officers. Rochefort, still in his bathrobe, walked them through the analysis, explaining how each conclusion had been reached. No navy in history had ever possessed such complete intelligence about an enemy's operational plans before battle began. Nimitz now knew things that many Japanese officers didn't know, but intelligence alone doesn't win battles. Nimitz faced a terrible calculus. He had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were in good condition, but Yorktown was badly damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Initial assessments estimated 3 months of repairs. Nimitz made one of the most consequential decisions of the war. He told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days to make Yorktown battle-worthy. Not fully repaired, not perfect, but functional enough to fight one more battle. The repair crews thought it was impossible. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock. Yorktown entered dry dock on May 28th and steamed out on May 30th. Approximately 72 hours of compressed miracle. Against Japan's 4 fleet carriers and experienced aviators, Nimitz could field 3 carriers with less experienced pilots. The Japanese had been at war since 1937. Their naval aviators had hundreds of hours of combat experience. But Nimitz had the ultimate advantage that Rochefort had given him: perfect intelligence. He positioned his carriers at point luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese after the first strike on Midway's airfields. The Japanese, confident they had achieved surprise, expected to attack an undefended island, then hunt for American carriers they assumed were still at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, believed he would have hours to conduct operations before encountering any American opposition. The possibility that 3 American carriers were already positioned northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush, never occurred to him. Japanese intelligence had assured him that Yorktown was sunk, that Enterprise and Hornet were thousands of miles away. On June 3, 1942, Navy patrol planes spotted the Japanese fleet approaching Midway from the northwest, exactly where Rochefort had predicted. Each sighting report confirmed Station Hypo's analysis: location, timing, force composition, all matching the intelligence. The trap was set. At dawn on June 4, 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers and headed for Midway. American radar detected them 93 miles out. The defenders scrambled every available aircraft. The Japanese strike devastated Midway's facilities, but the island wasn't completely suppressed. Then came the first shock for the Japanese. American aircraft from Midway attacked the carriers. Marine dive bombers, Army bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers struck without success, suffering heavy casualties. But they forced the Japanese to keep their fighters engaged. They disrupted operations. They demonstrated that American forces were more capable than intelligence had suggested. Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision. His aircraft were returning from Midway, low on fuel. Should he prepare another strike on the island, or reload his planes with torpedoes in case American ships appeared? He ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs. Ordnance crews began removing torpedoes, replacing them with high-explosive bombs. Then, at 7:28, everything changed. A scout plane reported sighting 10 American surface ships to the northeast. Nagumo suddenly faced the possibility of American carriers in the area, something he had been assured was impossible. He immediately halted the rearming and ordered aircraft switched back to anti-ship weapons. The ordnance crews reversed course. The flight decks and hangars of all 4 carriers became scenes of controlled chaos. Bombs that had just been mounted were removed. Torpedoes were brought up from magazines. Fully fueled planes surrounded by loose bombs and torpedoes. Aviation gas fumes thick in the air. It was the most dangerous situation possible on an aircraft carrier. At 10:22 in the morning, American dive bombers arrived overhead. 3 squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had become separated from their fighters during the flight, but they had found the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had extended his search beyond the expected intercept point, gambling his fuel reserves. His decision paid off when he spotted a destroyer's wake. The Japanese carriers were attempting to launch their strike. Their decks were crowded with fully armed and fueled aircraft. Their fighters were at sea level, having just finished destroying American torpedo bomber attacks. 41 torpedo bombers had attacked with suicidal courage. 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. But their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters down and disrupted defensive coordination. The dauntless pilots pushed into their dives from 14,000 feet, screaming down at 250 knots. In approximately 6 minutes, they destroyed 3 Japanese carriers. The timing was so precise that to Japanese observers it seemed like a single, overwhelming assault. Akagi took a bomb through the flight deck that detonated in the hangar among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Admiral Nagumo had to abandon his flagship. Kaga suffered 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. The forward elevator was blown out. Fires engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Kaga's captain went down with his command. Soryu took 3 direct hits within seconds. The flight deck ruptured. The hangar became an inferno. After 20 minutes of firefighting, the captain ordered abandon ship. He remained aboard. All 3 carriers were doomed within minutes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had become separated earlier and escaped the initial attack. She launched strikes that badly damaged Yorktown, hitting the American carrier with bombs and torpedoes. But American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon and left her burning, like her sisters. By evening on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or abandoned. Japan lost 3,507 men, including many of her most experienced pilots. Among the dead were some of the most skilled aviators in the world, men who had bombed Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Their loss would prove impossible to replace. The United States lost Yorktown, which succumbed to submarine torpedoes 2 days later while under tow. American casualties totaled 362 men. In approximately 6 minutes of perfectly executed dive bombing, the war in the Pacific had changed. The transformation was total and irreversible. Japan had begun the war with overwhelming carrier strength. After Midway, she had lost 4 of her 6 fleet carriers and could not replace them. Japanese shipyards could not match American production capacity. The United States was commissioning dozens of new carriers. Japan would never again conduct offensive operations. The Battle of Midway was won by pilots who flew into overwhelming fire, by mechanics who prepared planes under impossible conditions, by commanders who made bold decisions, but it was made possible by intelligence, by codebreakers who gave Admiral Nimitz certainty about enemy intentions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The victory should have brought recognition to the men who made it possible. Instead, it brought bureaucratic warfare. Both Station Hypo and OP-20G in Washington claimed credit. Commander John Redman resented Rochefort's independence and his direct relationship with Nimitz. Redman's brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, held a senior position in naval communications and supported his brother's efforts to centralize control. Admiral Ernest King supported the Redman brothers. King believed in centralized command and distrusted Rochefort's informal methods. In October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo and reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The official reason was career advancement. Everyone understood it as punishment for insubordination. Rochefort had been right about Midway. His analysis had enabled the greatest American naval victory of the war, but he had bypassed the chain of command and made enemies. Admiral Nimitz was reportedly enraged but couldn't prevent the removal. Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after Midway. King's office denied the award. Rochefort would never return to cryptanalysis. He commanded the dry dock, a backwater assignment. He never received the sea command he wanted. He never advanced beyond captain. When he retired in 1953, it was without the recognition his achievement deserved. But the work continued. Station Hypo kept reading Japanese naval communications under new leadership. The intelligence supported the Guadalcanal campaign, the island-hopping strategy, and eventually contributed to Operation Vengeance in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted and shot down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft based on decrypted flight plans. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, died in the jungle based on intelligence from the codebreakers he never knew were reading his messages. His loss was a devastating blow to Japanese morale. Thomas Dyer remained at Station Hypo throughout the war, rising to captain. After the war, he became one of the primary cryptanalytic trainers for the Armed Forces Security Agency and later the National Security Agency. His techniques for using IBM machines influenced a generation of signals intelligence professionals. Edwin Layton served throughout the Pacific War and retired as a rear admiral. He spent decades working to get recognition for Rochefort's contributions. His memoir, published in 1985, provided detailed documentation of Rochefort's achievements and the injustice of his treatment. Joseph Finnegan, who discovered how to decrypt the date-time groups, continued his cryptanalytic career and became a leading figure in post-war signals intelligence. His breakthrough had been crucial to determining the attack date. Without knowing when, American carriers might have arrived too early or too late. The linguists, traffic analysts, and cryptanalysts who had worked those impossible hours went on to various careers. Most never spoke publicly about their wartime work due to classification that lasted for decades. Families didn't know what their fathers had done. The cryptanalysts carried their secrets in silence. The true scope of American success against Japanese codes wasn't declassified until the mid-1970s. Only then could historians understand how thoroughly American cryptanalysts had penetrated Japanese communications, how much intelligence had shaped major battles, how critical Rochefort's work had been. In 1980, a campaign began to secure proper recognition. Admiral Donald Showers, who had worked in naval intelligence, led the effort, joined by Navy Secretary John Lehman. The campaign gained momentum as classified documents became available. On May 30, 1986, almost exactly 44 years after Midway, President Ronald Reagan awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rochefort posthumously. Rochefort had died on July 20, 1976, never knowing he would finally receive recognition. His children accepted the medal at a White House ceremony. The citation praised his sustained superior performance and noted that his work contributed in large measure to victory at Midway. It was an understated description of the most important intelligence achievement in American military history. The story reveals profound truths about intelligence, leadership, and innovation. Rochefort succeeded because he combined rare skills, mathematical ability, linguistic and cultural knowledge of Japan, and leadership that fostered collaboration. His willingness to bypass bureaucracy showed moral courage. His insistence on accuracy, despite pressure, demonstrated integrity. Thomas Dyer's dedication to work extended shifts, showed commitment beyond reasonable expectations. The entire Station Hypo team demonstrated that impossible challenges could be met through collaboration and relentless effort. They understood that what they were doing mattered more than comfort or health. The technical achievement was extraordinary. Breaking JN-25 required not just mathematics but intuition and pattern recognition. With approximately 30,000 code groups in use, each message presented millions of potential meanings. Finding the right interpretation required years of accumulated knowledge and brilliant guesses validated through comparison. There were no computers in the modern sense, no automated tools, just pencils, paper, punch cards, and human minds working at absolute limits. The cryptanalysts worked knowing every hour counted, that the next message might save thousands of lives. The strategic impact extended far beyond Midway. Rochefort's work established that signals intelligence could provide decisive advantage in modern warfare. It demonstrated that investing in cryptanalysis could yield results that changed history. It showed commanders that trusting analysts and acting on their assessments could lead to victories otherwise impossible. The transformation of the Pacific War that began at Midway created ripple effects that shaped the world for decades. Japan's defeat led to American occupation and transformation of Japan into a democratic ally. The cryptanalysis techniques pioneered at Station Hypo evolved into the massive infrastructure of the National Security Agency. In 1985, a reunion was held for surviving members of Station Hypo. Men in their 60s and 70s gathered to remember working impossible hours in that basement, racing against time. They shared stories of the dive bomber attack that destroyed 3 carriers in minutes, of the water ruse that proved AF meant Midway, of extended shifts fueled by coffee and determination. Some wept, remembering colleagues who hadn't survived. Others marveled at what they accomplished with primitive tools. All understood they had been part of something remarkable, that their work had mattered in ways that shaped history. The reunion provided the first opportunity for many to speak openly about experiences that classification had kept secret for 4 decades. Edwin Layton, then in his 80s, spoke about what the team had achieved. He recalled Rochefort's certainty when presenting intelligence to Nimitz, the moral courage it took to insist on an answer when Washington disagreed. He remembered May 27, 1942, when Rochefort had told Nimitz exactly where and when the Japanese would strike. One surviving cryptanalyst stood and summarized what many were thinking. "We came to this war as mathematicians, linguists, engineers. We left as people who had changed history, not through violence, but through understanding. We read the enemy's mind, and in doing so, We saved thousands of lives and shortened a terrible war. Joseph Rochefort gave his career to do what was right, rather than what was politically safe. Thomas Dyer worked until exhaustion. Every person in that basement gave everything, because they understood what failure would mean. We proved that knowledge is power, that understanding your enemy can defeat him as surely as superior weapons. The Japanese codes looked unbreakable. Approximately 30,000 code groups, super-enciphered, constantly changing, but we broke them. Not because we were lucky, but because we were smart, because we worked harder than anyone thought possible, because we refused to quit. The Battle of Midway was won by pilots and sailors, but it was made possible by intelligence, by code breakers who gave Admiral Nimitz what he needed most, certainty. To the memory of Joseph Rochefort, who died before receiving recognition, to Thomas Dyer and every cryptanalyst who sacrificed sleep and health to read enemy messages, to the linguists, traffic analysts, and radio operators, to everyone who worked in that basement and never told their families because the work remained classified for decades. You changed history. You saved lives. You proved that intelligence can be the most powerful weapon. The story of how we broke JN-25 and gave America the intelligence that won Midway is ultimately about human capability at its highest level. You don't need to be strongest to win. You need to understand your enemy better than he understands you. You need to work harder than seems possible. You need to combine mathematics, linguistics, cultural understanding, and intuition into actionable knowledge. You need leaders brave enough to trust intelligence, even when it contradicts expectations. You need teams where ego takes a backseat to mission. Station Hypo did all of that, demonstrating that intelligence work, patient and analytical, performed in basements by people who never sought recognition, can be just as decisive as dramatic military operations. 6 minutes of dive bombing destroyed 3 carriers, but those minutes happened because of 6 months of cryptanalysis, because Joseph Rochefort believed it was possible, because Thomas Dyer would work extended shifts when necessary, because mathematicians, linguists, and analysts refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable, because Admiral Nimitz trusted intelligence enough to risk everything. The lesson of Midway is simple but profound. Knowledge is power. Understanding is victory. Intelligence in every sense can change the world. The codebreakers proved it, and in proving it, they helped save civilization from tyranny. The Battle of Midway was won in many places, but it was made possible in a basement at Pearl Harbor, where exhausted men transformed impossible into inevitable, where 5-digit numbers became keys to Japanese intentions, where innovation and determination combined to achieve what had seemed impossible. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976 in Torrance, California, at age 76. He died before receiving his medal, before the full story could be told. But his legacy lives on in the intelligence community he helped create, in the methods he pioneered, in the proof he provided that understanding your enemy can be the most powerful weapon of all. The codebreaker who read Japanese minds and changed history, the man in the bathrobe who worked in a basement and won the Pacific War, the officer who sacrificed his career to do what was right, the mathematician who proved that knowledge truly is power. That was Joseph Rochefort. That was Station Hypo. That was how America learned to read Japanese messages, and in doing so, learned how to win a war that had seemed unwinnable in the dark days after Pearl Harbor. The story stands as one of history's greatest intelligence achievements. It demonstrates that wars are won not just by force of arms, but by force of mind, that the most powerful weapons are sometimes formulas and expertise and will. June 4, 1942 changed the Pacific War. But the true transformation began in the patient work of cryptanalysts who refused to accept that Japanese codes were unbreakable, who worked impossible shifts under crushing conditions, who proved that intelligence could be as decisive as aircraft carriers, who demonstrated that understanding your enemy is the first step to defeating him. They were the codebreakers who gave America the intelligence that won the war in the Pacific. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.